Okay, welcome to our seventh session of education in the United States. This week we look at students. We put the idea of a youth culture in a historical context, but we're also going to talk about abuse, cheating, and of course you're going to have a seminar on leadership. Okay, so the idea of this lecture is to kind of put the idea of a youth culture in a historical perspective. This idea of a youth culture that is a culture distinct from childhood and adulthood really begins in the 1950s, the so-called era of the teenager. Right? During this time, and immediately before this time, you have new labor laws that prevent teenagers from working in factories. But you also have, following World War II, a quickly expanding economy. And what that means is young people at this time have more money and more free time than ever before. It also meant that more and more young people were going to high school. Right? They're not able to work in factories. So they're going to go to high school in larger numbers. And so for the first time, you have many teenagers sitting side by side in classrooms, segregated from their parents. Right? All of this contributes to a distinctive teenage subculture marked by particular patterns of behavior, fashion, and values. And what you have to understand is that before the 1950s, if you were a teenage boy living in a city, you were likely to go to work with your father. And if you lived on a farm, you were likely to just work on that farm. And if you were a girl, you were likely to go to school for a few months out of the year. But then you'd be working with your mother around the house. And this is the first time that that's not happening. That these young people are now going off and being by themselves, away from their parents for significant periods of time. And so if you think about what that does to generational shifts, right? Before it was you were a child, and then you slowly became an adult, but there wasn't this idea of a teenage period of your life that we now today sort of take for granted as just part of the human experience. So really teenagers were just truly young adults who had similar experiences to their parents. Well, now that changes during this time. Accompanying that is the growth of the high school, right? By 1950, 80% of American teenagers attend high school, and that's a significantly larger number than in years past and generations past. So an effect of this is, for the first time, adolescents as a social group were segregated from the rest of society for a significant amount of time, 4 years, for 10 months, 5 days a week. And James Coleman is a sociologist who back then identified this phenomenon. He called it the adolescent society. He said this place has its own norms, its own artifacts. He went into high schools and observed. He noted distinct social hierarchies. The athletes were valued. Academics were not as valued as much, though this shifts the older students become. And this is one aspect of American civilizations where schools do, in fact, impact society in shaping this generation of young people. So you have this growing youth culture that also exists outside of the high school. It's exploited by record companies, radio programs, television, print media, and so on. There's trends in music and fashion that are marketed directly to young people. Now this happens in the 1920s. You might recall from your own history classes that the 20s had its own cultural movement, like with the flappers and the fashion trends of that time and the dance crazes and all that. But it sort of goes away during the Great Depression. All that's put on the back burner. And that doesn't happen in the 1950s. This youth movement is much more expansive. And then it sticks around. I mean, it takes on a different form every generation. But the idea of a youth generation, of a distinct social group of teenagers, really sticks. And a lot of this has to do with the size of high schools. The average American high school had between 800 and 900 students. So this contributes to the intermingling of young people from different socioeconomic statuses, and sometimes different ethnic groups, so not always, as we know. It further segregated young people from their parents' watchful eyes. So this psychological distance between generations develops. And it's an even more powerful effect when it happens in larger high schools. So consider the impact that this is going to have on young people growing up in cities versus those that grow up in the suburban or in the rural areas. So how does this independent youth culture develop at this time? Well, we probably know a lot of this, right? There's a rapid rise in rock and roll. Elvis Presley, the Beatles, and I don't know how old your parents are, but my parents are of this generation. They were baby boomers, so they're a little bit after this. But I always remember my parents growing up talking about how much their parents hated the Beatles and were terrified of Elvis, and that just seems so tame to me. And we see the same thing happening over and over again. There's new dance crazes during this time, new trends in fashion. Before this, students in high schools dressed like miniature adults. They would wear suits and ties, boys would, girls would wear dresses. But with more working class children attending high schools, these norms begin to be challenged and shaken a little bit. Right? The idea of wearing a suit and tie to school becomes outmoded. And by the 1970s, jeans and t-shirts have become the norm, much to their parents' chagrin. There's also a dramatic shift in sexual mores. Right? There's a rise of non-marital sex increases, so too does out-of-wedlock pregnancies, naturally. And though I would imagine a lot of people who lived during this time fondly remember the 50s as this era of kind of puritanical ideas and traditional values, we know that's not quite the case. And as a result, there's calls during this time for sexual education curriculum. And obviously in some circles, that's still considered controversial whether or not schools should be teaching about sex ed and whatnot. But this comes out of these trends. Okay, and these trends are influenced first by the rise of consumer culture in the 1950s. Right? So with this expanding economy, you have more companies offering competing products. And the idea of brand names takes on new meaning during this time. In fact, during the so-called kitchen debates between Nikita Khrushchev and then Vice President Richard Nixon, during this time, Nixon shows off the American appliances as a sign of American civilization that, we can go and buy a dishwasher or a washing machine, and we have choices and whatnot. But there's also the working class experience, right? Working class teenagers were unlikely to go to high school before this time. But now they are. And all this leads to drinking alcohol, smoking cigarettes, driving fast cars, a hint of sexual promiscuity, right? And an overall desire on teenagers' part to distinguish themselves from the past clean-cut generations, right, from their parents. So there's this powerful appeal of rebelling against adult authority, even if most teenagers don't actually really do that. But think about like the James Dean movie, Rebel Without a Cause. So how did the schools respond? Well, during the 60s, there's a resurgence and an interest in progressive education, right? Education that's more responsive to the needs and experiences of young people. So there's courses that are created that would cater to young people's interests. There's also, as a result of that, though, a weakening of that core curriculum that sort of defined the high school up until this point in time. And there's a loosening of the code of conduct at schools themselves, not just the dress code, but it's most obviously evident in the dress code. But school rules start to become a little more laxed at this time. Okay, now those people who were born in the late 1940s, early 1950s, go on to be called the baby boom generation. And the reason they're called the baby boom generation, if you're not familiar, is that World War II lasts from 1939 to 1945. America doesn't really become involved until 1942. 1941 is the bombing of Pearl Harbor at the very end of 1941. But even in the late 30s, it becomes apparent to most people in the United States that America is going to have to get involved in this conflict in Europe and Asia. And so the mobilization effort begins. And once that happens, a lot of people about 10 million Americans serve in World War II. And as a result, people who would have started families earlier don't have a chance to do that. And so once the war is over, by the time these folks get home, they want to get to their normal lives, or what they would have done had there not been a war, which involved having kids all at once. All right, so everybody was having kids within this 7 or 8 year period of time, and it creates this baby boomer generation, the largest generation up until that point in American history. And by the mid-1960s and 1970s, the baby boom generation is now in high school. It's the first generation to reach near universal high school attendance. and they share a communal suspicion of the older generation. They also have had a common set of social and cultural reference points. Many are suspicious of authority figures. Of course, many baby boomers embrace traditional values and lifestyles. We know that to be a fact. But many were raised in institutions like the high school, and as a result were highly suspicious of authority figures, especially political figures, the police, military, and so on. This is partially or very much influenced by the Vietnam War experience and the Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Movement confronts racism and discrimination and reveals the gap between the rhetoric of freedom for all and the realities of life in a segregated United States. We'll talk more about that in our next session when we talk about diversity. But the draft and the resulting anti-war movement also succeeds in radicalizing many young Americans. Right? Many young people are questioning the virtues of America's involvement in Southeast Asia, especially after atrocities are reported in the news, and it leads some to question the validity of American democratic institutions more generally, when it appears as though we're imposing our will on third world countries. There's also moral outrage over the shootings at Kent State. Great Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young song, Ohio, is about this incident. The release of the Pentagon Papers, which suggested that Vietnam was not a war that we stumbled into, but a war we intended to get in on. And Watergate, of course the break-in at Watergate, all lead to deeper frustrations with traditional authority figures. And so the historical experience of these events contributes to a rising level of skepticism on the part of young folks. But eventually, this counterculture of the 1960s and 70s becomes a mainstream thing. Right? Politicians figured out that if they want to get reelected or elected in the first place, they've got to appeal to the values of the baby boomer generation. And by the mid-1980s, the baby boomers were the mainstream, to the shock of many of them. Right? They began to have children of their own, and they look for stability in their own lives. And that stability usually takes the form of employment, civic engagement, church life, etc. And it's against these norms that the baby boomers generation, it's against these norms of the baby boomer generation that younger generations would then rebel, right? So I'm of the next generation. I was born in 1980, so my parents were baby boomers, and then, myself, I can see myself and my friends and my generation rebelling against that. And of course, my parents began to say the same things about my music that their parents said about Elvis Presley and the Beatles. And so I looked to them and I said, well, you all turned out okay, you figured it out, you became adults, and I see no reason why we won't do the same. Now, I won't attempt to describe today's youth culture, except to say that the trends covered in this lecture have continued to expand. Right? We're always going to see a youth culture develop in similar ways to the ways the youth cultures before it had developed. With digital media, there's even greater specialization in what types of music, fashion, TV, movies, etc. young people can seek out. All of this is to say, the generational distance between you and your students will continually grow as you move throughout your career. And that can be scary for some folks. Once you enter the classroom as a teacher, many of you will likely to be say, those damn kids, much like your parents did before you. I know that I did. Okay, and I'll add a little caveat to this, a little side story just because it feels relevant. I grew up on a farm. I'm from a farming family. It means I have lots of cousins, many of them older than me, many of them younger than me. And I was having a conversation at a family reunion with a couple of my cousins, one of whom was young enough to be one of my students, and I substitute taught in her classroom, and one who was, about 7 or 8 years older than me. And my cousin who was older than me was saying, these damn kids today, they don't have any respect for the authority and yada, yada, yada. And, I said to him, Dale, but weren't we like that when we were younger? Weren't we making trouble and so on? And then we turned out okay. And he said, no. There's something fundamentally different about this group of teenagers. This youth culture is fundamentally different from ours. And he seemed hopeless about the future. Anyway, my younger cousin, we somehow got into another conversation, and my younger cousin said, do you remember the time you substitute taught for me and I called you Timmy and you said you got to call me Mr. Patterson because you were the teacher? We all laughed at that. Well, my cousin Dale, who was just telling us how his generation, was much better behaved than the current young generation, launched into this reminiscent description of how anytime he and his friends had a substitute teacher, they would make it their job to try to make the substitute teacher cry. And I said, Dale, do you not see the irony in the story you're telling right now? Right? You just told me that the young generation, they're awful. Your generation wasn't so bad. And here you are telling me these awful things about what you would do to substitute teachers. Anyway, the point is, he actually said, you know what, I guess you're right. I guess maybe every young generation goes through its own phases that seem strange to us. Right? And regardless of how youth culture manifests itself, how frightening it might be, just think of Miley Cyrus, keep in mind that every rebellious generation slowly becomes the mainstream. And so in building personal relationships with your students, like Mohini and Sagan recommend, we can attempt to understand what motivates them inside and outside the classroom. It's not about, you don't have to like what young people like. And I'm not saying you have to go out and watch the same movies as them, or read the same books as them, or listen to the same music. But what I think you should be aware of is, or you should have some interest in, is the world that they live in, and the values that they hold, because they might be different from ours. And in this way, we can begin to design lessons that at the very least speak their language. Okay, so the rest of this session, this is a very brief lecture, the rest of this session is about student experiences. So there's a couple things I need you to do besides the seminar leadership. The first is to go to this wiki page, okay? And on this wiki page, and we've done wikis before, it seems like everybody's got a good handle on it. But on this wiki page, sorry about that, took us to the wrong link. In the space below it, I want you to contribute one issue young people are likely to face outside of the classroom that will impact their performance inside the classroom. One issue, only contribute one. Right? I want everybody to list one. Once we have a complete list, so maybe come back here around Thursday, what strategies might you employ to counteract, work with, or understand these issues? Okay, and I also need you to head over to the discussion leadership page. Okay, we head to students. And there are two things I need you to respond to. So the wiki page does not count towards your 3 comments. Nor does this, okay? You're all mandated reporters. And what that means is if you see something that gives you the sense that abuse is going on or negligence is going on in a student's life, you are legally obligated to report it. That also means if you report something and it turns out that nothing is going on, you cannot be held legally accountable. So what you need to do, and again, this does not count towards your seminar grade, but what you need to do is review Connecticut's frequently asked questions regarding abuse, and also review Connecticut's definitions of child abuse, because remember, every state has a slightly modified definition of abuse. And then what you need to do is, and by the way, I could not find one of these for the state of Connecticut. You can only find one for the state of Pennsylvania, where I'm certified. But there is a training manual that involves interactive scenarios. Okay, and what I want you to do is pick out 2 or 3 scenarios and answer what you would do. Right, so you read the scenario about what's going on in the classroom or in the student's life, and then decide what the appropriate route is, and it'll tell you whether you got the right or wrong answer. So do 2 or 3 of those, or maybe 3 or 4, as many as you want, really. And then just respond. What surprised you? What was exactly like you thought it would be? And then the last thing is, I have a cheating prompt, just to talk about advice with regards to handling cheating in the classroom. Then, as usual, we have our seminar leadership. So if you have any questions about upcoming assignments and so on, you know where to post them.